Hello from the German house in New York City, and welcome to On Thin Ice, Global Impact of Climate Change in the Arctic. I am Eva Bosbach, Executive Director of the North America Office of the University of Cologne. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 9th Transatlantic Tandem Talk of our series, which we established in 2021 on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of our North America office, and in which we showcase various research topics from the University of Cologne in Germany and our partners here in the US. Today's topic explores current frontiers and open questions in Arctic research and the potential impact of permafrost thawing on the global climate system. Climate changes affect us all, which is also why the University of Cologne has global responsibility and sustainability efforts at its heart. For example, recently, we opened 2 new liaison offices in Africa, in Egypt and in Ghana, and established a new position of Vice President for Sustainability. This year, we ranked second in Germany in the QS Sustainability Ranking, and will submit a proposal for a new research cluster of excellence called Sharing a Planet in Peril to investigate causes and consequences of global environmental change in cooperation with scientists, particularly from the Global South. I'm delighted that today, besides the main speaker from the University of Cologne, we have an alumnus of the University of Cologne as Tandem Talk partner, who is currently a researcher here in New York at Columbia University. This event would not have been possible without our wonderful partners for the Transatlantic Tandem Talk series. So let me thank the German Center for Research and Innovation, DWIH New York, the German Consulate General New York, the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD New York, Deutsches Haus at NYU, the Goethe Institute New York, the German Embassy in Washington, D.C., America House, NRW, 1014 Space for Ideas, the German Research Foundation, DFG North America, and last but not least, our newest partner, the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Welcome to the team, and what an honor to have the president of the American Friends of the AVH, Mr. Christian Hänel, with us today. He will now give you his short welcoming remarks, and then we proceed to the Tandem Talk. Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva, and welcome everybody. Again, my name is Christian Hänel. I'm the president of the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation here in Washington, D.C. We're the American partner organization of the German Humboldt Foundation. We're very happy and honored that we were invited to join the group of partners for the Transatlantic Tandem Talks. Our mission at the American Friends is to facilitate transatlantic exchange and collaboration in research and science on the relevant and pressing issues of our time. And by the way, speaking of alumni, I'm very happy that one of our alumni, Betsy Baker, is here today as well. She will moderate the session, a true Humboldtian. So we work on issues such as public health, international security, and global warming. And when we talk about global warming, we have to talk about the Arctic, because basically climate change starts here. As long ago as 2016, the World Economic Forum proclaimed, forget the FTSE 500, the Arctic is the real barometer for global risk. The Arctic is undergoing rapid and unprecedented transformations. The effect of climate change in this region are stark and far-reaching, and from the melting of sea ice to the thawing of permafrost, the impacts of climate change in the Arctic are reshaping the very fabric of this very fragile ecosystem, with profound implications for biodiversity, indigenous communities, and global climate systems. The effects of climate change in the Arctic are not confined to the icy expanses of the north. They reverberate across the globe, affecting weather patterns, sea levels, ecosystems far beyond the polar circle. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's a social, economic, and geopolitical challenge that demands collective action and global cooperation. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Arctic, where the intersection of environmental change and geopolitical dynamics presents a host of complex and interconnected issues. In recent years, the Arctic has also emerged as a a bellwether for the broader geopolitical shifts and security challenges facing the international community. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has sent shockwaves through the region, exacerbating tensions and raising questions about the implications for Arctic governance, security, and environmental protection. This conflict underscores, I think, the interconnectedness of geopolitical instability and environmental degradation, as well as the urgent need for coordinated action to address both. Russia has about 15,000 miles of coastline along the Arctic Ocean, and Russia's war against Ukraine has put essential collaboration in the Arctic more or less on hold. In view of such complex and interconnected challenges, the importance of international cooperation cannot be overstated. And that is why formats and platforms like today's Transatlantic Tandem Talk are so timely and relevant. I'm looking forward to a very engaging discussion, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian, also for reminding us about the geopolitical implication, and it's all interconnected. Thank you so much. Before I hand over to our moderator, here just a quick technical information for everybody. At the bottom of your screen, you see buttons such as your microphone and camera icons. We kindly ask everyone to stay muted during the presentations, but would like to encourage you to turn on your video if you are comfortable with it, so that our speakers can see at least some of you. Also, feel free to use the smiley face button if you want to show reactions. And also there is a Q&A button where you can type in your questions for the speakers for the Q&A after the presentations. I would now like to hand over to the moderator of today's talk, Professor Betsy Baker, who is an international lawyer and director of a marine science organization based in Alaska. And Betsy, you are in Alaska right now, so that's very exciting. She's working on ocean law and Arctic policy with over 25 years of experience. Plus, as alumna of the German Chancellor Fellowship Program, she's also a Humboldtian. So thank you, and over to you, Betsy.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you to all of the organizers and the hosts. It is a pleasure and an honor to introduce our speakers, and we'll go right to that. Dr. Jannik Martens is a postdoc research fellow at Columbia, and he studies climate change at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. He studies climate change and carbon cycling in the Arctic, exploring processes like permafrost thaw, ocean acidification, and the glacial history of the Arctic. Martens focuses on past climate periods as references to understand ongoing and future climate changes. To study environmental change of the past, we'll hear a lot more about this today, he is specialized in geochemical techniques using specific molecules and isotopes in sediment cores and microfossils. He obtained his PhD from Stockholm University and his bachelor and master's in science at the University of Cologne, where he had the opportunity to work with our second speaker, Dr. Jannik Rethemeyer, who is professor for organic geochemistry and radiocarbon dating at the Institute for Geology and Mineralogy. She also runs the radiocarbon sample preparation lab of the Cologne Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Dating Center. From the polar regions to the tropics, her research has crossed different geological timescales. For the past 15 years, she has studied the Arctic carbon cycle, notably the storage and release of organic carbon from thawing permafrost soils. A key question here is how quickly the organic matter can be broken down after thawing, and how much of this ancient organic carbon is released into the atmosphere. These are all issues that also have very much relevance today, as we see in the thawing here in Alaska and around the Arctic. Dr. Rethemeyer has a diploma from the University of Bremen and a PhD degree from Kiel. Both of our speakers have traveled repeatedly to the Arctic for marine and terrestrial research expeditions. We're very fortunate to learn from both of them today regarding what permafrost thaw can teach us about the loss of permafrost in our modern world, the role of carbon cycling in climate change, and much more. Jannik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Betsy, for this very nice introduction. I'll just start sharing my screen. And I think this should come through to everyone now. Thank you very much for everyone joining us this discussion today. I'm very excited to see so many folks online. So we're going to focus on the impact of climate change in the Arctic. But before we zoom into the Arctic, I just want to remind us all that the most recent year, 2023, has been the warmest year actually on record since humans started measuring temperatures. And with about 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. So that is the time before 1850. And the Arctic is affected by this change most particularly, and some people refer to the Arctic as the bellwether of climate change, because here the climate warming affects a temperature change that goes as abrupt as like 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. So the Arctic warms much, much faster, and this is directly connected, and a big portion of this change is related to the so-called ice albedo effect, which is when we have white shiny surfaces, such as ground that's covered by snow or sea ice covering the ocean, returning a big portion of the sunlight and the sun energy that hits the ground back into the atmosphere. Whereas when we have darker surfaces, such as open ocean conditions, or whenever the snow melts, has an effect that much of the sun energy is converted into heat. And this is a feedback loop that causes this rapid warming in the Arctic. And we've already heard now that the Arctic has an overarching importance to the global climate system. And we hear a lot about tipping points in the climate system. And one of the key takeaway messages here is that many of the tipping elements we see in the climate system are related to the high latitudes. And what is a climate tipping point? A tipping point is a system change in the climate system, often of abrupt nature, and leaves behind an irreversible change to the climate system. And they're usually activated upon a certain amount of warming. And one of those tipping points can be caused by the Arctic sea ice decline. We've already heard about this a little bit, how it affects the heat balance and the warmth in the Arctic. And these are all connected. So the decline in Arctic sea ice causes downstream effects, including ocean circulation patterns. It affects the Gulf current, which is important for North America and Europe and the climate there. And it has a large impact on the heat distribution on the planet. So we see that over the observational record of sea ice over the past 100 years or so, that the sea ice distribution and the sea ice cover has already decreased by up to 40% or so. And depending on the different emission scenarios now, so how much more CO2, carbon dioxide, and methane will be emitted into the atmosphere by humans, we see that the decline in sea ice will probably reach a point that we see largely uncovered conditions, so largely ice-free conditions in the central Arctic in the second half of the century. And sea ice is not the only effect that is so dramatically affecting humans across the planet. Another really important mechanism, of course, and we have all heard about global sea level rise, is the decay of ice sheets. So most prominently, the Greenland ice sheet in the Northern Hemisphere, and then, of course, the large ice masses we find in Antarctica. And the reduction in ice sheets, so the melting of ice sheets, affects everyone on the planet. And we have millions of people really living in close proximity to coastlines and to oceans, where even a sea level rise of about a meter or so would have a really large impact. We have entire countries where a large proportion of that population actually lives really close to the sea level, or if not under the sea level, in fact. And this projection here, which is retrieved from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report 6, just came out 2 years ago, is now an integrated signal. It combines ice sheet losses from both hemispheres, from both the Arctic as well as Antarctica. And the Greenland ice sheet takes a big portion in this. And there are two things I want you to take away from this graph. And one thing is I want to highlight is these large uncertainties, really. Of course, we have uncertainty around the emission scenarios. This is pretty much up to us, right? Like how much climate change mitigation we are willing to put in to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to mitigate climate change. But then there's also, you see this large uncertainty envelopes. This is mostly related to our poor understanding of these systems. We don't really fully understand the internal dynamics of ice sheets and how they respond to a warming climate. And another key takeaway here is that this graph, which goes until the year 2150, is actually interesting what it does not show. And this is how does it continue after that time frame. Because you can see in the nature of this development, this line doesn't seem to be likely to stop at that year. It will continue to melt. Ice sheets will continue to melt over these time frames. And one thing we need to really do as Earth scientists and climate scientists is to discover the long-term stability of these ice sheets. And this is a very busy graph, but it will take us a little bit out of that focus on the climate in the Arctic now, but more in the climate system in the bigger picture. We look at the last 65 million years of the planet's history. And this is only a small portion of the long 3 to 4 billion year history of our planet, but it is the most recent one, and we know much about this compared to the earlier periods of time. And you see on this black curve, you see this long-term decline in temperature over these periods of time. And we come from a climate that was probably like something like 15 degrees warmer than today, through to a period through 10 degrees and 5 degrees warmer. And then the most recent period of time, the past 2 million years, is what we call the ice house climate. We have changes between warm periods and ice ages when, for instance, New York was covered by a mile of ice or so. And this long-term decline in temperature directly relates to the long-term decrease in atmospheric CO2 concentrations, which you can see on the bottom plot here. And this is, I think, a very powerful way to show and demonstrate how atmospheric CO2 and temperatures on the planet are directly connected to each other. And there's one interesting takeaway here. And you see these gray bars at the top here. And these are the existence of polar ice sheets. And you see that first we have an initiation of glaciations of ice sheets in Antarctica. And then, importantly, around 15 million years ago or so, before today, we have an expansion. We have the startup of an ice sheet in Greenland, and then there is a larger expansion at 3 million years ago. And now if you go to the bottom right corner, you see the industrial age. So this is us. And we see how we have sort of derailed and we have broken out of this very narrow path of where atmospheric CO2 concentrations were over the past 2 million years. And we have returned into a climate, maybe for instance, 2020, which is indicated on this map, on this plot, reaching about 400 ppm in atmospheric CO2 concentrations that has not existed for the past 2 or 3 million years. And this will have great implications for the existence of these ice sheets. So what we need to do is we need to understand better the climate under which these ice sheets can exist. And one approach is here to compare the climate of the past really with the different ice sheet extents. And we know that the ice sheet was much, much smaller during these earlier periods when the climate was warmer. And I was lucky enough to participate in one of the, well, I will say one of the last expeditions actually of the International Ocean Discovery Program on the JOIDES Resolution in fall last year. The JOIDES Resolution is a very magnificent research vessel. It's a drill ship specialized on drilling into the seafloor, several hundred meters deep into the seafloor. It's been on the oceans over 40 years, and it contributes really a significant amount of knowledge really to how we understand how the climate system works and in Earth history. And we drilled sites alongside the northwestern glaciated margin really to discover these periods of time. And here's some illustrations, some pictures, takeaway from that expedition that I was part of. And you can see that this is really a significant amount of energy sort of invested into drilling into the seafloor. And it's really highly skilled staff and engineering and very impressive work. It feels great to be part of such a big research effort that allows us to go back so far in time. And if you're interested in this more, there was actually a quite extensive outreach program part of this expedition. We had 2 outreach officers on board who would do like daily open house tours on this expedition. And if you scan this QR code, you would have access to a YouTube recording that shows you about over 1 hour, the different aspects and the different work packages and things that were conducted on the JOIDIS resolution. Now, before I hand over to Jannik, I just want to briefly talk about permafrost. And we've already heard about permafrost a little bit. But the thing with permafrost is that it contains vast amount of carbon, mostly plant organic matter. And the great danger is that once permafrost starts thawing, it will make a lot of that carbon available to microbes, which can then be returned into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide or methane. So scientists are also interested in exploring how permafrost interacted with the global climate system in the past and how sensitive permafrost was during periods of past climate change. And most notably, we're interested in this very recent transition. Again, this is the part when this is the most recent transition about 17,000 years ago or so, when New York was covered by a mile of ice until it wasn't. And exactly that transition, we are very intrigued by, and we'd like to understand how did permafrost soils and landscapes develop during this period of climate warming. And this is actually work that goes back to my time as a PhD student in Stockholm, where I was really fortunate to work on these great sediment cores from the Central Arctic Ocean around the North Pole, essentially. And we did chemical analysis on these sediment cores, and we found that carbon release from permafrost was several times larger during these warming events than it is today. And this tells us really something about the nature of carbon release from permafrost. It might, in fact, be something like a tipping point. It does not seem to go ahead in a very linear way, but it seems to go abruptly, as you can see in these peaks here. But Jannik will talk much more about this. And before I hand over to her, I just want to make a little announcement about the virtual tour we have planned after the conclusion of the talking part of the Transatlantic Tandem talk. I'm actually sitting right now in the core repository of the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. So it will be very exciting to have Professor Bärbel Hönisch joining us today, who is a professor for Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University and is an expert really on paleo records and paleoceanography. So together we will explore the different exhibits we have in this repository. And now it's time for Jannik, I think. Stop share.
Yeah, thank you very much. So thanks, Jannik, for the kind of introduction. So, but I will now focus more on the terrestrial part. I'm studying terrestrial permafrost mainly, and not so much marine. Yes, and we will now have a closer look at the Arctic region in a warming world. I will show some results from the Far East, where we have stopped working, unfortunately, but we did this since, yeah, I did this since 2010 or so. Yes, here in this area, in the Lena River Delta and the New Siberian Islands. So this map shows in white the area of permanently frozen continuous permafrost, which is frozen more than 2 years. And in blue, you see the area of sporadically frozen permafrost. And when I start the video now, you will see in this model simulation that this area of blue sporadically frozen soil is increasing over time. It stops in the year 2017. And you all know about the 1.5 degrees target of the Paris Agreement. In this scenario, 1.5 degree warming, we will have a reduction of permafrost area of about 30%. When we go to 2 degrees Celsius, we will have 40% or more. Why do we have to worry? Like already mentioned, that we have a lot of carbon stored in the ground, and you see on the left side in the map here, the brownish area. This is these are the areas where up to 100 kilograms of carbon are stored per square meter, and this translates on the right-hand side. You see in a total amount of 1,800 gigatons of carbon, which is more than 2 times that we presently have in the atmosphere, and much more, 3 times more, stored in the vegetation. Yeah, this means we have a climate feedback cycle that is already mentioned by Jannik. Less sea ice means we have less reflected light and it's getting warmer, but we also have the so-called permafrost carbon feedback. meaning when the Earth gets warmer, we have higher ground temperatures, permafrost thaws. We have a degradation of the exposed organic matter by microbes. They release the organic matter finally to CO2 and methane, which increases the greenhouse effect and makes it even warmer. So it makes sense to have a look at that. And the difficulty is that our way to predict this is really limited because we don't know enough about the region. It's difficult to work there, to go there. And so model predictions, like in this study, who compares two model estimates and two different scenarios. The one in red is business as usual. We continue in we do at the moment. And the better scenario is we are successful in reducing our emissions by 50% in 2050. And you see, when you compare these models, both estimates of each model come up with a really wide range of 200 to 500 gigatons of carbon for this bad business as usual scenario, but both models also are quite different. So we have to improve that. Otherwise, it's really difficult to make proper predictions what additional carbon will be contributed to the atmospheric CO2 rise. Yeah, when this study explored what will happen with the climate tipping points that were already mentioned by Jannik, when we cross the 1.5 degree aim, and you see I marked in yellow boreal permafrost abrupt thaw, which already is thought to cross a threshold when we get higher than 1.5 degree wing. And there's also continuously thawing permafrost, which is here in red, which has a higher warming limit. And you probably read in the press that last year we already had 1.5 degree warming in 12 consecutive months. So we somehow are very close to the aim, but on the long term, we will reach, so this is only for 12 months. But when we continue working business as usual, emitting as much as we do at the moment, we will cross the threshold in 2033. So we should have a closer look at the tipping elements which react in these climate sensitive area. And this is a picture I took when I traveled to the Arctic several years ago. And this deposit, you see, it's very ice-rich material. All these white stuff here, it's ice. It's about, it may be up to 80% ground ice. And the Russians call it Jedoma. It's kind of less, you probably know. It's silty material and it's high ice content. And because of the high ice content, and it's thawing rapidly because the ice is thawing rapidly and then everything is collapsing. And what Jannik and I did together is we had the opportunity to work on a drill core of these permafrost, which covered a time frame from 11,000 years until 55,000 years, which is the end of the glacial period to the early Holocene. So this is how it looks like. It was done by a really large Russian-German team, and it's really a pity that we cannot continue working together because it was really very good collaboration. You see how the core is removed and then cut into slices, and all these slices, they represent different time intervals, and the sediment was deposited under varying climatic conditions. So, and what we were now interested in is how fast the organic matter can be degraded upon thaw. And this is related on the one hand to the composition of the plant material in the sediment, but also on physical properties like the formation of aggregates, which I tried to illustrate here. You probably know it from your own garden that you have some bigger pieces that form around a root. And you see here in the interior of this aggregate, there is the organic matter kind of protected against so the microbes cannot access as rapidly as when it's just free. So and there's another mechanism, which is the binding of organic matter to mineral surfaces, because they are charged, as the organic matter is also charged, so they are bound together, like illustrated here. And both of these mechanisms may kind of slow down the degradation. And because of the Rethemeyer being a very fine-grained material, we thought potentially it's not that difficult. It may reduce emission rates. So what we did is we did some lab stuff. We disrupted aggregates by sonication, and then we had a sequence of sieves and tried to isolate these compounds to analyze the organic carbon content, as well as incubate it and see how microbes respire and degrade the organic matter. And what we found is that there is a quite huge amount of 75% organic carbon, which is absorbed onto mineral surfaces, not in aggregates, but on mineral surfaces. The aggregates don't play a significant role in the deposit. So you see here, this is the core coming from 55,000 years and ending at 11,000 years. And the red line shows the temperature fluctuations during these time periods. So here it's a bit warmer, then it cools down, it's getting a bit warmer, and it cools down. Here is the last glacial maximum. And then it's the deglacial period when it's getting warmer. And you see when it's cold, we have more of this absorbed carbon. And when it's getting warmer, it's less. And then we try to find out how degradable the material is. And this fits quite nicely to these trends. When it's warmer, the material is kind of not that strong adsorbed to the mineral surfaces and can be respired much easier than when the sediment deposited under colder conditions. So this is important. And what is important to remember is that you cannot consider these as a single homogeneous pool. It's more complex. And this is lacking in models predicting climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. It's complex. The system is complex, and you need to have a closer look at these differences. So what we also did is we also measured in the field CO2 fluxes. We had some self-made devices. You see here a respiration chamber we put on the ground. We then had a pumping, removing water and trapping the CO2 on zeolite, which you may know from your dishwasher because it absorbs water, but it can also absorb CO2. And when you first remove the water, you can absorb CO2 in the zeolite and take it back home, because it was not that easy to take back home CO2 samples from Russia. Working in Russia was complicated and it took long. And what we then did is we tried to figure out where the CO2 that we collected came from. So we thought, okay, Rethemeyer deposit, it is ancient organic, also maybe some inorganic carbon in the ground. And on top, it's young material. And when the ice wedges collapse, the material erodes and everything is mixed. So we thought, okay, we have 3 different sources. And we then used an isotopic mass balance using the stable 13C isotope and radiocarbon. And you see that young and ancient organic carbon have the same 13C signature, but one is modern and one is 30,000 years old. And you can distinguish inorganic carbon by its 13C signature, but it's the same age like the organic carbon. And this is what we estimated we measured in the field respiration chamber and found that about 50% of the ancient organic carbon, as well as a really significant amount of inorganic carbon, is released into the atmosphere. So apparently this can be degraded rapidly, because this was not for sure, because it's kind of in a freezer since millennia. And then we also did a short-term and a longer-term to have a look into the future. So we warmed this soil and also did this calculation. See, this dark green area is getting larger. So the amount of ancient carbon that is degraded is getting larger. So that means that we contribute that this freeze-locked organic matter is potentially is contributor to the green effect. So, yeah, to sum up, this is the result from my study, but a large portion of 5 to 15% of the permafrost carbon pool could be released over the next decades or centuries when we continue business as usual and warm the earth and emit as usual. But we have also large uncertainties, not only about the stocks of organic carbon in the ground, but also on the processes regulating these release. So we need to continue working there and making model studies, and we should also implement these results in the models. And I also want to mention that it's really a pity that we cannot continue working in the Russian Arctic, because this is a really large area. And there are 21 monitoring stations, as you see here, that are stated there, and they are not kind of continued anymore. So, and this may bias our results quite strongly. So this is really a pity. Yeah, this is my last slide.
Yes, and thank you both to Jannik and to Janet for very complimentary presentations. And I will say that from the perspective of somebody who works more on the policy side of permafrost thaw and carbon release, we focus more on what are the implications for human life and human infrastructure from the loss of permafrost. So it's very helpful for me to understand more about the very large concern that the release of carbon from thawing permafrost creates for global warming generally. I thought we would take about 10 minutes just for the speakers to interact and exchange with each other, because your work is quite complementary. And then we will open it to questions from the audience, which are starting to come in. So I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. I guess one question to start with, Janet, you focused primarily on carbon, but you also are involved in some research on methane, and that's a more up-and-coming area, a newer area of your research. If you could maybe just introduce that into the conversation for the rest of the morning.
Yes, of course I can do. So yeah, we did a quite large amount of work now on CO2 emissions. And so I have a new project now with colleagues working on methane, and we now started a project on Greenland, which is a pity because the Russian Arctic is kind of more relevant and it's larger. We still process understanding. And what we see on Greenland is that it's getting wetter. Winters are getting wetter and summers are also getting wetter. And wet means that more methane is produced because it needs anaerobic conditions. So we need to have anaerobic conditions. And as you all know, potentially methane is a much stronger greenhouse. It is 20 to 30% stronger. And when we have some more methane emissions, it's causing more trouble. But it's very limited, the information that we have so far on methane, because most research was on CO2 emissions, and processes and information are quite limited. But yeah, it's getting better, and people are investigating in more detail what happens in lakes and wetlands and in the Arctic region. And I think it's depending quite strongly on how the Arctic develops, how wet it gets, how this will control methane emissions, but it's also the temperature. Temperature generally enhances microbial decomposition, and thereby more greenhouse gases are produced. But methane is still kind of, something has to be done to understand this process in more detail.
Yeah. Thank you. And that relates also to a question for both of you. The question is to both of you. I guess I'll ask Jannik to address it first. You both talked about climate tipping points. And Jannik, especially in your presentation, you seemed to indicate from some of your slides that there might have been climate tipping points in the past. And what does the geologic record tell us about those tipping points?
So I think tipping points in general is something that we describe as an abrupt change or something that is irreversible. In the past, we see climate patterns in our records, and this goes to marine sediment records as well as into other cores like ice cores. We see abrupt changes in the past that we fail to fully understand. And where we cannot really say one-to-one, like there were tipping points in the past, we see these like very abrupt changes. And one good example of that is in the North Atlantic, for example. Like our sediment records indicate that abrupt temperature changes occurred in response to ocean circulation patterns over time. And these seem to have occurred within a few decades to 100 years or so. And this is maybe one of the best examples to demonstrate like how severe abrupt transitions can be and what kind of long-lasting effects they can have. And whenever we see these changes in the past, we also know that they provoke large ice sheet melting at the same time, such as those glaciers covering North America and Greenland. And we know that a lot of icebergs were actually at these times sort of released into the North Atlantic. And this is something we don't want to see in the future, of course, because it would mean that, I mean, the North Atlantic ocean circulation is already slowing down. We have actually measurements that demonstrate the slowdown of the Gulf current, as we also refer to. And an abrupt change and an abrupt release of meltwater might even make this change more severe.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that gets to a question that we have for both speakers now, turning to the audience questions. Not only thinking about tipping points, but at longer term temperature changes, whether they're tipping points or not. We're still in the cool house. And somebody asked, what would the Earth look like if we got into the warmer conditions, like +4 degrees or +6 degrees, as Earth has already been some million years ago, as your slides showed us? Maybe if each of you could give us your take on that, that would seem to be beyond a tipping point.
Yeah, I can start with that. So it's not so my favorite topic, but yes, I think it's difficult to predict how the future looks like because there are many feedbacks in the system, and this makes it difficult to see to really predict how it will change the Earth and to compare it with times where the CO2 content was really high, like in the Cretaceous period. It's really also difficult because we didn't had a North Atlantic current, and all the heat transport was different, and it's not comparable with that. But we already have some indications, like the atmospheric circulation system is shifting, and we see that the tropics are getting even warmer, and we see some of the Atlantic, North Atlantic current, which will cause cool down of the northern parts of our hemisphere. But yeah, all the interactions, how these different systems, the tipping element systems interact, makes it really difficult to predict how the Earth will look like.
And Jannik, what is your take on the question?
Yeah, I can fully agree with that. It is difficult to predict, and also the past obviously offers a comparison, a point of comparison, but it's also not one-to-one applicable to the future, really. So we must there's some sort of shortcomings when we do these comparisons, but nonetheless, they're incredibly powerful and important for us to understand the system as such and what kind of things affect the ocean and the atmosphere and the climate system in general. Yeah. Can you remind me of the question? I'm sorry.
Well, we were specifically wondering what the questioner asked, what would the Earth look like if we got to +4 or +6? And I think Janet made pretty clear it's a little hard to know, but I think the other part of the question that I found interesting from the person who asked is, the Earth has already been that cold that warm, excuse me, 1 million years ago. And one of your slides showed us that. But what struck me about that slide is the very, very short period in which we have increased temperatures since the industrial age. And I don't know, maybe that is one of the reasons that both of you seem to conclude that it's really hard to predict, or it's hard to compare future warming to what we've learned from the geologic record. So you've talked a bit about the geologic record as being just sort of one laboratory that you can compare the results from. So I don't know if you have any further thoughts on how we can compare results from the 1 million years ago to what we're seeing today and what might happen in the future.
Sure. As I indicated, we have this long-term record, and it seems to indicate, though, and it is pretty clearly a connection between the warming and the increased atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere. And the atmospheric CO2 is not going to go away so fast unless we take actual actions to sort of remove it. And we still have several decades to go, I think, where we also are still counting on sort of emitting CO2. Our climate change mitigation strategies allow us to sort of go ahead for a few more decades. And then depending on how much climate warming we allow ourselves, like is it 2 degrees, is it 3 degrees or so? Of course, this will have a long-lasting effect in the atmosphere. And we know based on our knowledge about the Earth system that there will be a warming. It is more difficult to predict what kind of amount of warming, I think, like how bad will it be? And one more point that comes to mind is that we as a species, and this is maybe one of the most severe effects of it, are not adapted to a climate really, because as I said, like we get into a climate state that has not existed for the past 2 million years or so. And us as modern humans, we have been around for 1 million years or so. We are simply not adapted to this really warm temperatures. And certain parts of Europe and North America might become essentially uninhabitable at a certain amount of temperature. So these are also certain effects we need to take into account. And as I said, yeah, the geological laboratory, so to say, is a valuable archive, while certain aspects of it might not be applicable one-to-one, but the overall understanding of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and the temperature are still valid, though. I mean, these are the governing and most important and significant factors of our climate system.
Thanks. And we will turn in a minute to other impacts on human and plant life and other animal life from the warming. But we had another question for you, Janet. Are there currently research results about permafrost in the Amazon basin, since you have worked in the tropics, or at any of the sites shown on the global maps that you used?
Do you mean mountain permafrost?
I'm looking at the questioners. Are there currently research results about permafrost in the Amazon basin? I don't know what where you have been working and whether you can even address that question.
So I mainly worked in the Russian Arctic, as well as a bit on Svalbard and on Greenland. So what kind of results?
Yeah, I don't know who the questioner was on that one, so I can't pursue that further at this point. Maybe
on that note, we might say that the Amazon is of course a tropical environment, right? And so we probably not expect permafrost here. But one thing I can mention is the deforestation, which is extremely abrupt over the past couple of years and decades. Now it's been slowing down, I believe, with a new governmental change in Brazil. Jannik? But the deforestation releases also large amounts of carbon dioxide and methane.
Yeah, but it's right. It's not only the permafrost that's important, but it's also normal soils that also may contribute, because there's also accelerated decomposition with higher temperatures. but it's more the permafrost that matters because the carbon was freeze-locked since millennia. It was not in exchange with the atmosphere.
Right. And the fact that the carbon is now clearly exchanging with the atmosphere is certainly of importance on the policy level. I'd like to turn a little bit to some of the questions about effects for the people living in the Arctic and the communities. I know that the Arctic Council, which is one of the governing bodies, or was fairly effective in producing scientific research on issues affecting the Arctic, is now hoping to turn more even to the Rethemeyer as part of the permafrost problem, just the potential for release of massive amounts of carbon and possibly also methane. So one of the questions asks, to what extent do you work with local people living in the Arctic and integrating them in your projects? And I guess this goes more to observations. My sense is that both of your research focal areas are really on the coring, and but do you, either of you, involve observations of local peoples?
So we do not, or I do not, but I was a postdoctoral researcher at Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research, and they really expanded work on this issue and really try to quantify what happens more on the quantitative way, how much infrastructure, how much roads, railways, and building will be affected by the thawing ground, and also trying to come up with costs that are of the thawing ground, and because you have to repair all these damages. And there are also groups working with local people, and but it's me, so I cannot say anything about it.
And Jannik, do you have any comments?
And it's mainly it's mentioned Arctic that really will suffer because it's a large area. Also Alaska, of course.
Right. Jannik?
Yeah, a tricky one is always these large ship-based research expeditions. I can tell a little bit about that expedition I was on last year. So the entire scientific crew traveled into Iceland in Reykjavik, and this is where we started the expedition, and this is where we ended the expedition. And in the meanwhile, we would go all the way up to Greenland, but we didn't land in Greenland. We didn't interact with anyone on land, unfortunately. But part of the project, though, and there's increasing amount of funding for this, and I think it's a good development, is to include also local groups with that. And we had several outreach campaigns during that expedition, which would actually have a direct computer video link, like this open house event we had with schools in Iceland, schools in Greenland, excuse me, to tell them about the research we were doing. And I guess it is a little bit more easy for field-going research to the Arctic, where you actually are on land, of course, because then the interaction are more direct. And when I went to to northeastern Siberia back in 2023, I believe, no, this is last year, in 2014 or 15, we would work together with some of the local people, not maybe directly people who are living in these very remote areas, because that's also a reality that, especially in Siberia, but also that's probably also true for Alaska, that it's very, very remote areas. You're far away from any kind of infrastructure, because we want to study the permafrost, the natural system, as it is in the pristine sort of way. It's not where it's not disturbed by human interactions. So we go far away from local settlements and such. But there seems to be an increasing amount of people who really try to include research and build these bridges to local communities. And when I was a PhD student, I was part of a bigger European Union funded project called Mineralogy, which was actually a transdisciplinary project engaging a lot of social scientists and then natural scientists, which was an interesting mixture, because the way we work and the way we publish and do research are fundamentally different in many ways. But the goals and the perspectives and the ideas that we have are very similar, and we all wanted to find out how does climate change in the Arctic affect humans. And the social scientists actually had those conversations with people in Iceland, in Svalbard, in Greenland. And I think the synthesis of this report, of these findings, are still coming out these days. The project is partly still ongoing. But I found it overall very stimulating, these interactions.
And it's an important question, and one that we work on a lot at in the number of projects I'm working on. And certainly what the funding requires of the scientific research is a driver onto how much interaction and with Indigenous colleagues in Alaska has improved. And there is a great deal of literature regarding how the scientific methods of the researchers and the observation methods and their own Indigenous science work together, and how they should be treated. Observations from both groups really can be quite complementary. And I think permafrost is an excellent example of that. I mentioned earlier how important it was for me to hear this talk today and understand more of the science behind what we do and don't know about carbon release. And working with Indigenous colleagues here in Alaska, observations, one man from the interior of Alaska, Athabaskan, talking about Yetama and wanting to raise the concern globally for the impacts that they are seeing locally for the loss of permafrost. We see it visually in losing a stable haul road so that oil trucks and other supply trucks can go back and forth up to our north slope where oil is drilled. We see buildings being lost, but we don't tie that to other human impacts on things other than physical infrastructure. And I think the importance of our talk today is to show that permafrost thaw is a concern, certainly for the physical infrastructure, but also for the impacts on the buildings and the roads and heating plants, other things that are more visual observations. I think we have about 1 minute left, and one would like to, several speakers have asked you to speak to, or questioners have asked you to speak to the present and future potential of cooperative mechanisms, especially given the situation in Russia. And do either of you have thoughts on how science cooperation can continue in that context?
Yeah, difficult question. Some scientists already made to different countries. I think many of the collaborators I had in Russia left the country, so we continue collaborating because outside it's possible, but it's really difficult because we had strong collaborations and a station that was run together, and I think it's difficult to continue it this way. What we do is to use the materials that we have in our fridges and still continue working on what we have and do it this way. But I don't think, in my view, that the situation will change in the near future in Russia. So it will be difficult.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, given the time constraints of just an hour. And quite honestly, we could do an hour on each of the topics raised, on the future for scientific cooperation with Russia, on the human impacts of permafrost thaw, and even digging deeper into the science that you so effectively introduced us to. So thank you to both of our speakers. Thank you to our audience. There are many questions we didn't get to, and hopefully we will be able to continue the conversation in a future broadcast. But would also like to thank our sponsors. There are many, many partners who bring this work together, and I will read the list again for those of you who weren't on at the start of the Zoom. The University of Cologne, New York office, the German Center for Research and Innovation in New York, the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Both the German consulate in New York and the German embassy in Washington, D.C., the Deutsches Haus at New York University, the DAAD, the DFG, the Goethe Institute, and the American Institute of North Rhine-Westphalia, and finally 1014, a space for ideas in New York City. Many, many people make these conversations possible, and thanks to all of them. And for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to stay on now for the tour of the sediment core collection at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. Thank you. And you can just stay on and we'll go right to the tour.
We will dive right into it. Yeah, thank you all very much. And with me here, I have now Bärbel Körnisch, who is a professor in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University. And Bärbel actually has a diploma in marine biology from the University of Bremen and did her PhD at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research in Bremerhaven in Germany. And now she's been a professor for the last couple of years here at Columbia University at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. And Bärbel is an expert for reconstructing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, actually. And now we're actually here in the core description room of the repository. So this is the best venue to show these things, actually. And I think we will be very excited to show you a few things we have here. I will try to move this conversation now to my phone. I hope it's not gonna, the connection is not gonna die, but we will sort of walk around virtually with you. Mute. How's this?
That works?
Much better.
We can hear you.
Fantastic.
We can hear you. Yep.
Great. So I will change the camera. And now you have the eyes and ears, and I will follow Bärbel a little bit through the core repository.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you for this nice introduction. And also to all of you for staying on. So we're here in the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory core repository. This is a repository that has been around since 1949. It goes back to a time when the founding director of this observatory decided that it would be a very good idea to create a library of the seafloor. The reason why we're interested in seafloor sediments is because unlike what we just heard about in the permafrost and in terrestrial sediments, for instance, the terrestrial environment is a place where erosion is happening. The seafloor is a place where deposition is happening. And so we actually get a really beautiful record of past climate changes by looking at the sedimentary deposits on the seafloor. And so we can take sediment cores from that, where when we go from the sea surface, from the bottom of the seafloor, we get the youngest things on top, and then the deeper we go, the older it gets. And so this is one example of what we're doing here. So the repository, just to give you a sense, in 1948, there were about 100 sediment cores drilled worldwide. When Lamont was founded, the director decided that on every single cruise that we were taking, we should take one sediment core on every single day. And so within just about a decade or so, there were over 1,200 sediment cores that were collected. This over here is a map of the seafloor. And all of these little white and yellow and red dots, they indicate cores that are present here in this repository here at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. Now, to give you a sense for what this is, so you have to imagine that when these cores were originally taken, we did not know very much yet about how best to store them. And so we can go into one of our repositories where we have a number of sediment cores that are lined up here. Typically, the cores that we're taking, they're somewhere on the order of 10 to 15 meters or so. And then every single core gets split up in 1.5 meters or so to give us a sense for what the information, for us to allow them to sample. And so I'm just going to pull one of these out here. So these first course, this is just a very short section of a couple of centimeters. And you can possibly see that this is mostly loose sand. There are a couple of harder pieces in there. This is something that was realized relatively quickly, is when you're storing these sediment cores dry, then of course they dry out and they turn into sand. And that makes it very difficult to follow up with this timeline of younger things on top, older things at the bottom. And so the newer sediment cores that we're working on right now, those are actually cores that are not stored in metal, because we actually now also work a lot on trace element ratios. So we want to make sure that there's no contamination from metals in there. But they're also stored closed, so they cannot evaporate, and they're in a cooling room. And so we do have cooling. This is actually a former cooling room here. We had a repository here of these very deep sediment cores that Jannik was, for instance, part of when he went on the JORDIS resolution. Those sediments were about 15, 20 years ago. They were actually consolidated in different repositories. But the cores that were here, they're actually now in Bremen. I used to work on those. You can see these are kind of cooling doors. So basically we would lock these doors, and everything in here was kept at 4 degrees Celsius. So essentially at the temperature that you find in most places at the bottom of the ocean. Now, we're not going into one of these rooms right now because the internet in there does not work very well.
We did try this before.
But we do have a sediment core laid out over here that comes from the Arctic Ocean. This was a sediment core that was collected at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. And maybe you can look at this core a little bit in more detail.
Let's start at the top.
So what you can see here is this is now a half core. So cores are typically round. They get cut into half, so we can look at the surfaces. You can see in this one that there are different color changes here. So it goes from lighter colors to darker colors. That is often an indication for changes in the amount of organic matter that is in these cores. It can give us an idea of how many calcium carbonate particles are in there and so on. What is particularly interesting about this one, for a core being from the Arctic Ocean, is that we have a number of larger rocks in here. So there's one over here, and there's a little one over there. This is the largest one that we see in here. So this is very unusual. You see they're very, very fine sediments. And fine sediments are something that you get in the center of the ocean, where you're far away from land. Now, these bigger rocks, they're very, very peculiar features. And the way how you get them into the ocean far offshore is not because birds are carrying them there, and not because people are dropping them overboard. That's what we do today. But in the past, the only way how you could transport this is actually by icebergs. So icebergs, as they're growing on land, they freeze parts of the bedrock into the bottom of that ice, and the ice is moving. So as more and more snow is falling on Greenland and Antarctica, that ice kind of moves off the continent, and at some point it breaks off into icebergs. And these icebergs are then floating in the ocean, and they take this debris that is caked into the bottom of that iceberg with them, and they drop it off in various different locations. And so this is what we now call ice rafted debris. It's material that was carried by the icebergs into the ocean. And this core here, so this core is now 1 meter and 30 centimeters long. And the top is over here. So this is what we call the Holocene. So that's the most recent time in Earth history. And when we go back to about 1 meter or so, that's when we have glacial sediments from the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago. And you can see that there are none of these so-called drop stones or ice rafted debris down in this bottom part, and we don't see any here at the top part. Where we do see them is somewhere here in this middle section. And this middle section is that time of the geological record when we have evidence that there was a lot of ice discharged from land, and so that indicates the melting of this ice as the climate was getting warmer between the last ice age and the modern. Now, this is just one way of how we can look at this. My research in particular, I look at fossils that are stored in these sediments, and we have a couple of examples here. So I mostly work on organisms that are called foraminifera. And foraminifera are tiny little organisms. They're in reality, they have about the size of a head of a pin. This is one example over here. Actually, this one is not very well defined. This is one species that we would find in the tropics. This is one that we would find in the Arctic. They probably all look like popcorn to you. They look like popcorn to most of us as we learn about them. They look a little bit different on both sides, but they have very particular shapes based on the species that is making them. And we can look into, here's actually a microscope. If you show these slides, that's essentially how we look at these foraminifera in the laboratory. We take these sediments, we wash them over a sieve, and then we look at them under a microscope. And if you look at this magnification over there, you can see how these organisms are actually looking like under a microscope. And so what I'm particularly interested in is that these organisms, they incorporate the chemistry of the water into their shells. And so as they do that, they actually provide a record of past climate conditions in these tiny shells that allow us to reconstruct what the seawater looked like at the time when these organisms were living. These foraminifera live typically on the order of 2 to 4 weeks. This particular polar species probably lives many months. And then when it dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. It litters the seafloor. So there's so many of them in these seafloor sediments. And so we can pick them out of there, and we can then analyze them. And from their chemical composition that they provide us, we can reconstruct what the climate was in the past. And because of that, we are able to reconstruct what the temperature was in the past. I am particularly interested in seawater acidity, which increases as we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that gives me a way to reconstruct the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. But we can find all kinds of information of how the ocean circulated, how much carbon was stored in the ocean, what the productivity of the ocean was, the organisms living in there, and so on. So those are all kinds of examples of what we can do with these sediment cores.
Thank you, Bärbel, very much. This was a very interesting tour through the core repository. And for all folks who are actually in the New York City neighborhood, I will just return this camera now to, well, we couldn't do like this. So the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory runs an open house every year in early October. I just checked in this morning. Actually, this year's event date is not known yet, but it will be determined soon. And this is a great opportunity to get on campus here. We're just 15 miles north of the city, New York City. And then we will have a big showcase here of the research that's conducted on campus. So for anyone who is more interested in this, watch out for announcements for the Lamont Open House in fall. And again, thank you all very much for this amazing event and for staying on for this tour.
Thank you from me as well.